I'm thrilled to be hosting this. This is the fourth Zoom monthly call that I've been doing. The first one was on sort of my story. Second one was on mindfulness. And the third one was on organ donation. And now we have the pleasure of having Kelsey Crowe come in with us. And let's see, I don't even remember how I connected with Kelsey. I think I must have read her book and then have been stalking her ever since. And she is, her book really spoke to me, and she wrote a little testimonial for my book when I published it. So I was very thankful for that. So today we're going to be going in for about an hour and 15 minutes, and I'm recording the call. I'll basically tell my story briefly, so those who don't know me can hear where I'm coming from and why I'm doing this work. And then Kelsey will talk about her thoughts on empathy, her research, and what it means to her and why it's important, especially today with the pandemic and the collective grief that we're facing. And we will also, if you have questions, comments, please put them in the chat, and we will take those types of questions when we're done talking. So I really appreciate everyone being here. And my story, I'll start out. My story began about 12 years ago now. In February of 2009, my daughter started having headaches. She was a freshman in high school. She was 14, and she started having headaches for a couple of weeks. And we thought, okay, she's a teenager. Teenagers get headaches, and we gave her Tylenol. And then when they started getting bad and she asked me to pick her up from school a couple of times, my mom radar started going off, but I just calmed myself down and just thought, okay, everything's going to be okay. Because things in our life had always been okay. My husband and I dated in high school. I have two other daughters. We just had been leading kind of a sheltered, normal life in the suburbs of Milwaukee. And the headaches got worse. And finally, on a Wednesday morning, February 18th, my daughter was sleeping in my bed because my husband was traveling, and she threw up in the bed and asked me why I had 4 eyes and had a seizure, all within about 45 minutes. And we called 911. She was revived by the time they got there. She had basically was kind of back to normal, and rushed her to the hospital, to Children's Hospital in Wisconsin. She was rushed there, and that morning I was told that she had a mass at the back of her head. And I remember thinking, all right, she has a mass, it'll be removed, and then everything will be fine. And then later that afternoon, the MRI told us that it could be operated on. It could be operated on in 2 days, when the operating room became available on Friday. And the evening progressed, and the headaches continued to get worse. And they gave her some pain medication, and my husband and I were in the room, and when she had a reaction to the medicine and stopped breathing. And at that point, they rushed her down for surgery, put a shunt in to relieve the brain pressure, but we knew something was wrong when the doctor came out and he said the procedure had gone okay, but she wasn't responding the way they would like. And the next thing we knew, we were up in the ICU room with her connected to every machine possible. And we just knew that, I knew as a mom that she wasn't there anymore. It was just this weird feeling I had. So she had been in school on Tuesday afternoon, worrying about her Spanish homework, complaining about her headaches. And on Wednesday evening, about 9 o'clock, she was not responsive. It was that quick. And we learned after a couple of days in the hospital, after a couple more MRIs, the doctors told us definitively that yes, she was legally brain dead, and that really there was nothing that they could do. We learned later that it was the type of tumor that she has is a rare childhood brain cancer called medulloblastoma. It only occurs about 350 to 500 times a year in the United States. And sometimes it presents like this very suddenly, and it's very deadly. It only comes in grade 4. So, as you can imagine, our world was shattered. This was our oldest daughter. And things like this just weren't what I thought were in our cards. These are things I thought that happened in the news, things that we would never encounter ourselves. It just happened to other people. And now we knew that those stories also happened to us, that we weren't sheltered the way we thought we would be. And so the next couple of weeks, couple of months, actually a couple of years, things were kind of a blur. And as we had to face being in a small community in Milwaukee and going from a private family to a public family, we were now the family that had lost the daughter suddenly to a brain tumor. And yet we had 2 other daughters at the time who were 12 and 9, and we had to figure out how to navigate life, even though we didn't want to, so that we wouldn't sacrifice our other 2 daughters' lives, who were 12 and 9, to something that we couldn't undo. Somehow my husband and I figured that out quickly, that we would have to keep living, because the thought of living the next 4 or 5 decades of our life being miserable was even worse than the concept of grieving forever was something we just didn't know how to navigate it. We didn't know whether we should wear black all the time. We didn't know what people would think about us. How should we behave? We just didn't have any guideposts. And we kind of learned quickly on that we needed to educate others about how to treat us. And we had to learn quickly to ask for what we needed and accept the help. We knew that this was such a big thing in our lives that we had to go through it, and we couldn't ignore it, for our daughter's sake and for our own mental health. So the reason we're here today is because I was fortunate in having a lot of friends and neighbors and family do a lot of things right, and then a lot of people who didn't do what we thought that they would do. And we realized people react to scary situations in very different ways. And in the past decade, I've researched everything from grief and mindfulness and empathy and resilience, and then I wrote a book about growth and wisdom and learning after death and after a tragedy occurs. And what I learned is that we appreciated so much the things that people would do, and mostly when people would just listen and feel our pain with us. They would witness the pain by sitting with us and listening. And some friends came over and cleaned out the refrigerator, and a neighbor brought over a memorial tree. Her gardener brought over a memorial tree. We hadn't even talked about it. And those are the things that really resonate with me as of today. And friends who just stepped up in a way that I will forever be grateful for. Texting me in the middle of the night and asking, do you want to go for a walk Tuesday or Thursday? How was your day? How was your day today? I learned very quickly on that there are certain things that people do and say that are very helpful, and that the worst thing you can do, even if you're scared about reaching out to someone, is to reach out to someone. That the worst thing you can do is ignore the person and not show up, because we had lost our daughter and we're going through this painful experience. We didn't also want to lose our friends and our family. And I've learned that our Western society just doesn't do grief well. We don't do trauma or tragedy well. We try to avoid thinking about it. We don't want to think about our mortality. We don't want to think about, we get worried about whether we're going to say the wrong thing. We worry about even whether we bring up the loved one's name for fear of making the mom or the person sad. And all I can tell you, and what I tell the different groups I talk to, is almost across the board, I've heard, name the person who passed away. Don't be afraid of bringing up that person's name and honoring their memory by talking about them. I would be in grocery stores and I would be going down one aisle and I could actually see an acquaintance going around the other, scurrying around the other aisle to kind of avoid me. And I understood why. They didn't really want to confront me. They didn't want to see my pain because it was so close to what they feared for their family. I think I represented the worst of their fears. I think most of us understand how we're all worried about when that next shoe's going to drop. When is the next bad thing going to happen to us? We don't know when that'll be. We don't know what that will be. But I was that example. Our family was that example of something out of the blue happening. It was more like a car crash rather than a cancer diagnosis. But it was something that people wanted to ask me, well, how long was she in the hospital for? What did you do wrong? Or what distinguishes her from what could potentially happen to my children who they want, they want to protect, obviously. So I had to learn that for myself, I needed to embrace the feelings and also share the pain with other people to tell them, no, everything was fine. One day can be good and the next day not so good. So that's where I learned to how important empathy is in helping the people that we care about. And it's not always a tragedy of the death of a child that we're facing. We know people who have gotten cancer diagnoses. We know people who have lost jobs, who have had a really tough time in the pandemic, who on and on, where life is scary, awful, unfair. And that is what Kelsey talks about, because we want to be there for the people that we care about. And we have to learn that we can't fix people's problems, and we need to be there in a very meaningful way for them. So let me tell you, as I mentioned, please feel free.
Are you watching that Zoom?
Can everyone mute, please? Let's see. I'm just going to try to mute everyone. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat room, as I mentioned, and I will introduce Kelsey. So Dr. Kelsey Crowe is co-author of the book, There Is No Good Card for This: What to Do and Say When Life is Scary, Awful, and Unfair to the People You Love. It's endorsed by authors Elizabeth Gilbert and Adam Grant. She earned her doctorate in social welfare at the University of California, Berkeley, and lives in San Francisco with her husband and daughter. She is also founder of Empathy Bootcamp, a training organization that provides synchronous and asynchronous trainings on empathy in times of grief, empathy, relational styles, and equity. Kelsey hopes for a day when no one suffers alone simply because others didn't know what to do or say. So Kelsey, I think I'm going to give you probably 10 or 15 minutes to just explain what prompted you to write this wonderful book and what types of things that you've learned about empathy in your research. Did I put you on mute too? Kelsey, let's see here.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Hi, thank you very much, Susan. And it's so nice to meet you all. I have a beautiful gallery view, so I can just see everyone here. And I imagine there's some story of pain that's bringing people here. whether that's your own pain or pain that you're seeing with somebody else around you. Or it could just be interest in this topic. But I just want to acknowledge Susan has her story. I have my story. You all have your stories. And so if you don't mind just raising your hands, if you have your story, not that you say your story, but if you have your story for being here, and, you know, just so that we all know, right? We are here together for the same reason, different experiences. So I just want to acknowledge your stories. And at any point in the chat or in the Q&A after, you can bring something up that's personal or not, and just ask a more informative question, okay? You know, what Susan describes so much in her book is, and why she reached out to me, is a topic that does interest me very much, which is how do we connect to people who are suffering? And I asked this question because I was so bad at it. I was in graduate school and a friend of mine was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I avoided her, what Susan described, you know, that people could avoid you. I avoided her. And I recognized that I wasn't just giving her space, but that I was afraid. I was afraid of doing something wrong. And that I believed other people were afraid of reaching out to people in their difficult times as well. And I thought people like me need a manual. We need some kind of instructions on what to do. And of course, we've all had that experience of not reaching out when we wish we had, you know, something that stops us. You know, we all have had that experience. And the reason that that experience bothered me so much when I was doing it to my friend Heidi is because I'd had such a powerful, disruptive incidents where I lost my mother to mental illness when I was 19, and she was my only family member. So it was like really fast when her paranoia took over and she blocked me out of her life, that I was all of a sudden without any family at all. And it's not an easy thing to communicate, right? The loss of the mind has no card at all. And so I was very confused about where do I go for the holidays? I had some health issues. Who do I ask to pick me up? Who do, you know, there was no one in the doctor with me, you know, all of these kind of things that you have assumptions about who might be there for you. It all required me asking. And at that young age, no one's going to think to offer, right? So I had that experience of isolation in times of grief that is an amplified version of what all of us experience in our times of grief on some level. And that's why my failure to connect to Heidi bothered me so much, because I knew it matters to show up, but I didn't know what to do. My fear was stopping me. So I'm a trained social scientist, and I decided to research this problem. And I did open-ended survey questions and lots of interviews to find out what worked and what didn't to get you through your difficult time. And I wanted to know about a number of difficult times, because these things happen in threes, right? There's not just like one difficult time. So you lose a job, you then get a cancer diagnosis, and you don't have health insurance. So then there's a financial insecurity, and then, you know, just things spiral. So I wanted a book that really was more about grief in general and not any kind of specific slice, because underlying all forms of grief are what I see as some key fundamentals. A loss of community, you know, a loss of security, whether that's financial security, security of who you're going to see every day, loss of identity. Who am I now? And do I describe myself as a mother of three or a mother of two? Am I a professor. I've been a professor for 20 years and now my position's been shut down. What am I now? How do I describe myself? And so these questions of identity, security, community, and then always shame. Susan, you mentioned that it wasn't only weeks and months, but years of you adapting to this new normal. And there can be a feeling of shame that you aren't yet over this, and that you're kind of broken now. So what does that mean? So the lot of aspects of suffering, despite the individual experience that we have, that we actually share in common. And, often people ask, well, what's the difference between empathy and pity? And many times pity presumes that wouldn't happen to me. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And Susan, you might have been somebody who pitied other people before this crisis happened to you, right? That you weren't that kind of family. And now you are that kind of family.
And I didn't want, and I didn't want to be pitied.
Right.
I wanted people to think I was strong, even though we had our obviously very dark moments. The one quote I've heard is empathy. Pity is I'm here for you. Empathy is I'm here with you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's struck with me, that it's like being on equal footing with the person that's suffering, not someone standing outside of your shoes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that means then, even if I've never lost a daughter, what is the fundamental change in community, identity, security that I've experienced? That means that I'm a messed up human too. And so messed up human to messed up human, I'm here with you. But when we see ourselves as detached, that experience would never happen to me, that experience may never happen to me, but some awful experience will or has happened to us. And so it is connecting human to human. And so, but a lot of times, and so what my book really talks about are the roadblocks that we have to empathy. What stops us from connecting human to human? And I call them empathy roadblocks. And on the most practical level, it's these things like, I don't have time, right? We're overwhelmed, especially in a time of COVID. Many of us can feel hyper affected mentally, financially, for many reasons. So I don't have time. I don't have the bandwidth. Another reason is I don't want to pry, right? People fear making you self-conscious or embarrassing you. I don't want to I don't want to make them feel worse, right? So if I mention your daughter's name, that could make you feel worse. That's just bringing it all up again, right? These are very common kinds of roadblocks that we experience. And underneath those roadblocks is some components of empathy being activated. So I can share a little bit about that if this is of interest. But first, before I do, does anybody recognize, you can put it in the chat or you can put yourself off mute and say it. Does anyone recognize any roadblocks in their past or now that they've had to reaching out to others? Like me with my friend, Heidi, I didn't reach out. I was afraid of saying the wrong thing. And I also didn't want to embarrass her. Does anyone, I'm trying to see if I don't know if I can see the chat. Oh, there. Anyone relate to having a roadblock?
I think one thing you mentioned about the pity versus empathy, it's when, I guess it's the fear of rejection from someone because they don't know how to handle a situation and all you want is someone to listen.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times people put their foot in their mouth and don't know how to support you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that same roadblock that stops you from reaching out because you don't want to say the wrong thing is one that you've observed yourself of somebody else putting their foot in their mouth. Is that right? Is that what you're saying? So we become kind of self-conscious about it, which is why grace is so important. Because the more critical we are of other people, the more critical we are of ourselves. But yes, absolutely. And people have said some of the worst things to me. I also had to have breast cancer a couple of times. And, you know, at least it's just breast cancer is something I heard a lot. And that's not something you want to hear.
At least I've learned at least is one of the least uh, positive things you can say to someone, even
Yeah,
in COVID, when you're
yeah.
talking to a daughter who missed out on high school graduation. You should never say at least, you know,
Mhm, mhm.
at least you got to go to your senior year in high school or whatever. I mean, just at least minimizes the pain.
Yeah, yeah. So I like to think of empathy as a kind of arc, and there's two fundamental components of empathy. One is in the brain, you know, various parts of the brain are triggered with different issues. So with when we feel for somebody else instinctively, that's called emotional empathy. That's affective empathy. That sense that you just get me. I don't need to translate my experience into words. You can just sit with somebody and they feel with you. Um, and that's a very powerful form of empathy. And it's in a very important form of empathy, emotional empathy, because it tunes us into that suffering's happening. We we resonate. It's called emotional resonance. You know, we're just connecting with somebody emotionally, and it tunes us in that there's a problem. The other key component of empathy is perspective taking empathy or cognitive empathy, where we are using our cognitive mental capacities to try to understand that person's situation from their point of view, because losing my loss will not be the same as somebody else's loss. That's impossible. So what could their loss be like? And you will never know what somebody else is going through with perspective taking empathy. I mean, there's limits to that. But the fact that you try is very important, that you recognize that somebody else is having their own separate experience. And Dr. Jody Halpern, she calls that empathic curiosity, where you are really interested in what that person's perspective is. And so both of those components work together to create empathic concern or empathy or compassion. You know, that's the engine that motivates us to act. And that act can be sitting with somebody and just being present with their suffering. It could be, Susan, as you mentioned, somebody who provided you a treat, right? Somebody who writes you a card. There's different kinds of empathic gestures. And what I have as a tool for understanding those empathic gestures as options for you is an empathy menu. And I've got something in my book. And the empathy menu is so valuable as like a list of possible things you can do, because it helps manage the expectations. That when you see 20 things on the menu and you just pick one or two of those things, it can take away the overwhelm. It can reduce the expectations. It can make us less self-conscious, less fearful. And we just do one or two acts that we like to do, that we know how to do, and just pray that somebody else is taking care of the rest. Because the minute we start taking on somebody's problem in a significant way, where we think we have to heal them of their situation, that's when we get into trouble. So for example, oh, Susan,
Yeah,
looks
no,
like
I
you.
love that. There's another author called Megan Devine
Yes.
who wrote a book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And her phrase that I love to repeat is, what are you supposed to do? Show up, don't ignore the person, listen, don't judge or interrupt, and then don't try to fix it. Because
Yeah.
I think that is one of the biggest roadblocks to us not wanting to offer the help, is we want to take away the other person's pain,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we can't.
Yeah.
And so
We can console.
We can, yes.
We can provide comfort,
Witness the pain.
witness, but through witness, right? But the minute we start thinking we have to fix somebody's pain, that's when we get into the outskirts of empathy that is dangerous. So remember that arc, right? So you have emotional empathy here, say perspective taking here. The two combined lead to a nice empathic gesture of presence, of, just whatever empathic gesture is right for you. Some people can't be present with someone else. It's not their talent. But gosh, they know they love flowers and they'll leave flowers at the door. They love to cook and they'll leave some food or whatever it is. So recognizing what you like to do and just make that gesture. But the minute we start feeling that we have to fix somebody's problem, which is what we're paid to do all the time in the workforce, and what our, is asked for us, competence, fixing, this is a realistic expectation that we have of ourselves as adults, but it is not a realistic expectation around vulnerability and suffering. So what happens is we get to the extremes of empathy, and one can be on the affective side, it's called empathic distress, where somebody's suffering causes us distress. We either feel the exact same level of pain that they do, right? Where someone's crying and then you wind up sobbing so hard that the griever is consoling you, right? Has anybody seen this? And this person, from a relational style in our work, I have trainers that work with me, psychologists, and we call this the flutter. And this is the person who's flooding the other person with their own emotions. And what the griever winds up taking care of the other person or minimizing it, saying, it's not that bad. I'll be okay. I'll be all right. Right? So that flutter can tend to also foist their help on the person. They wind up trying to do a lot of things to fix them. Has anybody been around that kind of person where it's almost too much advice? It's wrong advice. And they're just not kind of stepping back and being with you. They're trying to do things to fix you. And really what they're doing is trying to stop their own anxiety, their own empathic distress. So there are exercises that you can do, because we all have these moments. If, for example, I lost a child and Susan, you then lose your child, I am going to experience empathic distress. Like, it's going to bring all of those associations up for me. I will feel overwhelmed. How do I manage that becomes the question. Or, for example, a certain relationship will bring up more empathic distress. A grandparent who loses their grandchild will have a hard time being there for their child because they are in such grief themselves. I've talked to many parents who've lost a child who find it very hard to receive consolation from their own parents because there's too much empathic distress in the family unit. A pediatrician can, with equanimity, explain the results of a cancer diagnosis, but if their own child is diagnosed, they're going to have empathic distress. So that's very natural, but it's something that we can tend towards. And one of the reactions that we can have, depending on our, empathic styles that I talk about in another moment, in a course, is to flood this person. But another one can be fretting. I call them compassion's F words. Flooding, fretting, where we worry so much. Oh my gosh, what should I do? Is this going to be the right thing to do? No, wait, maybe I should do that. We ask a lot of questions. Susan, can I get you, do you want pepperoni or sausage on that pizza? And you're like, it's so not on my mind right now. Like, please just do it. Don't ask me.
It kind of becomes about the other person, and
it becomes about the other person doing it perfectly, doing it right. Because they become so anxious. So it brings up their fear of imperfection. And again, with us coming into spaces of vulnerability, feeling that we have to save somebody, fix somebody, and then it can become a very distracting force in somebody's life. And so we all have these reactions. We just need to notice that it's happening and then figure out how to manage it. And then the third F word. So there's the flutter that foists with advice, that feels so much that they wind up taking over the experience. You're not just sitting in somebody else's shoes, you wind up stealing them. But then there's the fleer. And so this person in a state of empathic distress where they don't know what to do, they don't know what to say, can avoid the situation. So many people are uncomfortable with these feelings, and the way that they handle it is to avoid them and avoid the person. And of course, losing a child, like you said, Susan, it's something that nobody on God's earth ever wants to have happen to them. And so that kind of situation will cause many people empathic distress, and they might flee, avoid you in a way that they wouldn't avoid hearing of a great grandparent who died at 106. You might not avoid that person. But if somebody then was lost to suicide, you might more likely avoid that person because it causes you distress.
Kelsey, when you're talking about the menu of empathic practices that people can take on a practical level, maybe we should ask if people have situations where they've either offered something or received something after a tragedy, and what their experiences have been. I know how would you phrase that to ask people?
Well, sometimes, and going into, these are the reactions that we can have. So the great thing about the empathy menu is it helps tamp it down. It says, you know what? I'm going to do something that I love to do and just offer up that gift. I'm not going to wait for them to ask. I'm not going to worry about prying. I'm not going to worry if it's enough. I'm not going to try to heal this person. I'm just going to do one or two little things. And that is so valuable, that trusting that that is enough. Because it's when we put these expectations on ourselves that we wind up in one of those compassion F word styles. So the empathy menu is a wonderful tool. And how I generated the empathy menu is by asking people to think through a time that you suffered. Could be now, or it could be a long time ago, and a gesture from a colleague or a neighbor or a friend that made a difference, that you remember as something that provided you comfort. And if you want to put it in the chat, or you can put yourself off mute and say it. If you think back to a gesture that made a difference for you.
So I was messing around with my webcam a little bit, and it doesn't look right. But I remembered one time when I was about to go pick up my son from the school bus, and I had just gotten news that not my father, but my sister-in-law's father, we spent a lot of time with him, and we just found out he passed from cancer. And as I was walking out to the school bus, I was just kind of holding it together. But then my neighbor saw me and just asked the simple question of, "How are you doing today?" And it just released in that moment. It's just one of those questions that I had always said I would answer honestly to people. And the tears just came pouring out. And in that moment, she just walked over to me and gave me the biggest hug, the most comforting hug. And she didn't really have to say anything, but just her presence there. And after I kind of muttered what happened, she just let me know that these tears were tears of love. And it was just so amazing that just those few words made so much difference knowing that someone kind of understood and didn't have to say too much.
Great.
Thank you, Shirley. Yeah.
So hi, this is all very emotional for me. It'll be 3 months tomorrow that I lost my son to cancer. And I read your book, Susan, right when he, recently after he had passed, which was so very helpful. And so May 5th was my birthday and May 9th was Mother's Day. And I really didn't know how I was going to get through either one. And I have to say the outpouring of love on my birthday, just text, I didn't even go on Facebook till that evening. But just the outpouring of love and the texts that everyone sent to me, I feel like all day I was just spent texting them back and thanking them because I was just so grateful because everyone's love and constant support has gotten me through these last 15 months, with my son's illness. And so I'm just so grateful to everyone. And it was just so helpful to me, just those touches that really helped propel me, throughout the day. And it doesn't take away the pain or the grief or whatever it is, but just to know that there were so many people out there that were truly concerned about my welfare and wanted to try to make this day as special as they could for me. And I was just really, really grateful to everyone.
I'm so glad, Nancy, that you received that kind of support. And I do remember that how important those touches were in those first couple of months.
Yeah.
I would say that people were the thing that helped when nothing else would.
Right.
And in fact, I became kind of addicted to people and talking. And when I would feel that lump coming up in my throat and that icky feeling in your body, and you didn't know where to turn, I would pick up the phone and contact a friend. And within the first couple of minutes of us,
Right.
of them hearing my voice trembling,
Yeah.
we would start talking. And 3 minutes later, I was back to kind of feeling better. It's very powerful.
It is. It is. And even when friends say, you can call me when you're having a bad moment, you just don't have to call me when everything is so good. Friendships are extraordinary, and you can see, who are your really close friends that are just going to be there for you no matter what. And it's just, it was comforting for me to have that experience.
So it's something as small as writing on Facebook or Instagram. And I think that's what Kelsey is talking about, is they didn't have to make you a lasagna.
Right.
If they don't want to cook, then they're not cooking, but you're appreciating what they did do for you, not criticizing what they didn't do.
Right.
Does anyone have actual sayings that people have said to you in tough situations that come to mind? Maureen, you can unmute if you'd like.
My cousin, who had lost a son several years before our son died, at the wake, he got a hold of my hands, and he's like 3 years older than I am, and he said, "You live for the living. You live for the living." And he said it 3 times. And there were mornings when, as I was waking up after those nights of thinking what a nightmare things are, that was my mantra for the day, was thinking about the rest of the family who was always also hurting, my husband, the siblings, the aunts and uncles. So it was very good advice.
That's really nice. I'm reading in the chat. Someone, one of the people said, "After my dad died, the 3 best messages I received: he loved you so much. What was his name? And I'd love to read his obituary when you have it." That's lovely. And then, the worst message came from my brother-in-law, who was a pastor. "Congratulations on your father's promotion." Wow. I love, if focus on the positive one, boy, I love talking about the relationship with the loved one. Sometimes if I go to a funeral of a friend and I don't, it's like say the friend's mother or father who I didn't know, I've learned that I can go up to that person and say, I'm so sorry. I know what a special relationship you had with your mother. And that is all you need to say. And then someone else says, I find it most helpful when a friend doesn't try to fix things and just listens. Sometimes I even let my friend know that I just need them to listen and not try to fix it or come up with a solution.
I have, I do some work on empathic listening, and we have 3 rules for, I'm looking at you, Jennifer, but on my gallery. So I just want you to know. And the first rule is to shut up or stop talking. The second rule is don't think about how you're going to respond. Right? Because so often we think we can anticipate what this person will say. And as a New Yorker, I really need to hear this because I interrupt people a lot. So don't think about how you're going to respond. And the third one is wait 3 seconds. So really give some time to see what else comes out. And we are not used to doing those 3 seconds, but really valuable. And now I'll do 4 seconds or 5, but super valuable, because just being present in times of grief.
And I think your book, the wonderful part about your book, and I will show it because I can say that it's very artistic. It's got all these different illustrations, and you paired up with, is it a friend? Emily McDowell that
she does those
the greeting card.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is that I remember in the first couple of weeks of Laura passing away, I would go to our mailbox, which was outside on our road, and I would honestly pick up a pile of cards this high, and I would sit in the car before even driving into my driveway, and I would open them up. And there were lovely cards, and I appreciated the outpouring from everyone. And I so appreciated the cards that had a couple of lines written on them about a memory of Laura or about something that they commented on about her. Those were the ones that I treasured. And so the fact that you were writing about, appropriate, like Hallmark kind of cards, the printed card is wonderful. And what you write inside the card is, I think, as meaningful or more. So even if you can come up with a couple of sentences that make some connection to the person who passed away, it's really meaningful. Because what I would say to people is, I don't have any more memories going forward with Laura, but I want to capture the memories that other people have of her, because those become new memories. And I think that is the case with anyone who's passed away, is we only knew one side of them, and lots of other people knew other parts of them. And so I think the best gift you can give anyone who's lost someone is to talk about them. And I think some people fear that it's going to make the person feel sad. And I never can understand that. I mean, I was thinking about Laura 24/7, right? I mean, it wasn't that I ever forgot that I lost my daughter. And so if someone came up to me in the grocery store and asked me how I was doing that morning, I appreciated it. And I would even appreciate more if they would actually say, tell me more about Laura, or I remember when Laura did this. But they didn't typically bring up Laura's name. I would have to be the one bringing her name up. And I would have to bring her name up in a very specific way. If we were talking about desserts, and I would say, oh, Laura loved that ice cream. And you could tell the person's face would get red but also relax because I had said the elephant in the room. I had said her name, and now they could talk about her as well. So that's one takeaway about being empathic, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other one, and I'll let you go on, is it's one of someone mentioned the how are you doing today, which I love. You know, the question of how are you is really difficult to answer, right? You just lost a child, you've lost a parent, even you've lost your pet. How are you? I mean, how can I be great? My daughter just passed away. And if I say that I'm terrible and I'm depressed and I'm, you know, in despair, people are going to want to run away from me. And that's not how I want to be perceived. So if you can ask somebody, how are you doing this morning? I could talk about how I had a nice breakfast with my husband, or I went for a long walk, and I can actually get into a conversation. And even if it's in the afternoon and I say, well, I was depressed and I took a long nap, at least it's the beginning of a conversation and not something that's just a trite response.
Maybe, I mean, I love it when people are talking. I don't know if there's, maybe people want to ask questions, or either of each other or of us.
I actually just had a situation. You brought up a pet. My good friend, her dog just passed away last night. It had severe pneumonia, and they took her to the vet, and they had to put her to sleep. It was too much. So this is helpful in figuring out how to approach her.
And it's something that happens to so many of us, right? So many people have pets. So everyone's going to lose a sibling or a parent in their lifetime. And it's something that we, in our country, it's like one of the last third rails of conversation that we just don't talk about death. And yet it's really it's about love that you're missing. You know, it's like, I always talk about grief is the absence. It's love with nowhere to put it.
Oh, that's a nice expression. Yeah.
So what?
Go on.
Sorry, when my son was in the hospital, the week before he passed, one of his young friends that he was being treated with the past year had texted him that he wasn't going to make it. And that next morning, I went and wrote a note to him, telling Tag what he meant to me and how much he meant to me, and how he touched my life so deeply, and left this note for him with his family. And happily, he made it another like 8 or 9 weeks. He just recently passed, but it was just, you know, I wasn't even thinking my son was going to pass that week. If someone told me he wasn't going to be there that Sunday, I would have said, you're crazy, because we just had so much hope. And that's just how I live my life. But just to being able to tell him, and even with my son too, everyone would share what they meant to him. And right before he passed, his best friend, told all of his friends from high school, Alexander's sick, everybody just, I'm sure he liked to hear his well wishes. And you can't imagine the outpouring of love of people and teachers. And they just shared all these wonderful memories of how much they meant to him, and to, for his good health and good wishes. And it's amazing when you can really see the empathy. And my daughter's trying to deal with now of, certain people aren't there, and she's having a hard time understanding. And today was really helpful. I took great notes because, and of course we're going to read your book, but just to help her understand why there's certain friends that can say certain things and not, and that doesn't mean they love her, don't care for her any less. It's just people do not know how to say it or what to say at this time. And so it's just been a learning curve for all of that, because you have such certain expectations of people, and they're like, well, wait a minute, why aren't they here? But there is, if you understand all of this, it makes it much more clear why. And it's not because they don't care about her, it's just they just can't at the moment express it the way they need to.
Yeah. And the empathy menu it's really there to help give people an out. So for not an out, but an avenue. So if your daughter has friends that are creative, maybe she could ask them or either show them the menu, but say, hey, you know, would you just write me a song or
Mm,
share with me a playlist that you think could help me at this time? If she knows people who cook, you know, or, you know, something like that, asking people to give their gift,
mm.
especially for younger people, they really have a hard time with these kinds of conversations. And they will regret it later. You know, we all, I mean, I have memories of when I was younger and people I didn't support because I was a fleer.
Mhm. Kelsey, I think you had talked at one point in a different talk that you've given about how it's sometimes the smallest gestures that
Yeah.
stick
Yeah.
out in people's minds.
I mean, I think that's what we're seeing. Like Shirley, for example, it was a small gesture to ask, how are you? And a significant but small gesture to hold her tears, you know, like hold her in that time. And that's all that person needed to do. They didn't have to then do these 5 other things. You know, Shirley's remembering that one time. Um, and I think too, often, like, so in live workshops, I have what are called gesture walls where people write out a gesture that made a difference to them, like what we talked about here. And it's incredibly powerful. All of the gestures that make a difference, 85–90% of them are these small gestures. You know, rarely is there a superhero that's described. And in truth, colleagues, neighbors, even a stranger, like, and so I from that have these 4 touchstones of showing up from those gesture walls and also from my research. And the first one is that people don't describe favors as a gesture. They don't describe, oh, I asked somebody to drive me to chemo or to sit with my son while I went shopping, and they did. They describe spontaneous offers. The Nancy, I'm thinking about your daughter. She's going to get fewer spontaneous offers because of the age, you know, so she might have to ask, pull it out of people. But often what people recall are those spontaneous offers. So the first touchstone of showing up is don't wait to be asked. The second one is the number of gestures that mattered from neighbors and from colleagues and strangers, which in my own life would have made a huge difference. And so the second touchstone of showing up is if you care, your care belongs. And that also then means if you don't care, don't put any pressure on yourself, because you're going to find a lot of people that you care about that you want to have that reserved for. But if you don't really care, know that your time will be coming just next week to support somebody who you care about. And that could be somebody very remote. It could be a colleague that you respected who you heard was diagnosed. You hadn't worked with them in 20 years, but you care, you know? So if you care, your care belongs. And then the third touchstone of showing up is no one describes anybody's level of training or expertise as gestures that made a difference. So we may feel that we can't fix it, that we don't know how to take away their pain. But the third gesture is it's not your expertise, it's your kindness. It's your kindness that is your credential. And we all know this for people that have showed up for us. It was their kindness. And who doesn't want to run away from the perfect people when their life is falling apart, right? I don't want to see perfect people in my life when I'm feeling less than perfect. But it's just people who can trust their kindness. So that's the third touchstone of showing up. Your kindness is your credential. And then the last one is, Susan, the one that you mentioned. Small gestures make a big difference.
I love that. I love the kindness as your credential.
That one comes actually from a wonderful talk that I attended from Dr. Charles Garfield, who supports trainers to work with the sick and dying. And in my book, I attribute it to him and all that kind of stuff. And that quote was the big shift for me, because when I started this research, I wanted just do's and don'ts. And I would interview people who would say they just showed up. And I was like, that's not enough. I need to know, what's the algorithm? What's the plug and play? Again, me not being good at this, I was like really thinking that there was something more to it. And at the end, when I heard him say that, I was like, of course. And then another great line that he has is, people always run away from the helpers. And by the helpers and the fixers, he means those people that are micromanaging your pain and your life, because it's too much. So just trusting in our kindness, that it is our kindness that is our credential, that small gestures make a big difference. It's good for the other person, and it's good for our own sustainability over time.
I also love the idea of vulnerability. And if the person grieving can be vulnerable and the person listening can be vulnerable, and there is really a connection that can be made there that's really created deeper friendships and relationships for me over the past decade, because they know who you are, and you trust them that they have your back as well. And so in my book, I also have a theme about this growth that comes after trauma or tragedy, and not in a Pollyannish kind of way, but it's just something that happens when you go through an event that shatters your assumption about the world, and you struggle with the emotions, and you end up finding meaning and purpose, hopefully, in that struggle. It doesn't mean that the event happened for a reason. It's not like, God gave you this in order to bear it, or there is a reason why Laura died. But over time, I've been able to craft a reason or a purpose or a meaning in what I'm doing right now, is teaching other people about what we went through and how others can perhaps do better, or go forward in a healthy way. And so yeah, I think the growth, that even recognizing that growth can occur, is very important, because to think that a tragedy can happen and that the rest of your life will be miserable is not something that is sustainable in my book. And so I think if we can recognize those glimmers of hope when we see them, and when we see them in other people that have struggled with illness or struggled with the loss of someone, I think it's just a healthier way and a more realistic way to view death and our mortality. So does anyone have any other questions that they put in the chat, or saying them out loud? We have about 5 more minutes before we wrap up. Rena?
Hi, Suzanne. It's not Rena, it's Milton.
Oh, hi, Milton.
I'm Rena's husband. I didn't see any men there, but I just thought, I was moved by the thoughts and so on. I think something that I said to Suzanne the first time I met her is, I'm sorry for your daughter's death and what you're going through. I cannot imagine what you must be going through. And so actually I use that line whenever I'm empathizing with someone who had a loss or something like that. I said, first, I don't know what to say. I don't know what you're going through. I don't want my enemies to go through what you're going through. I'm sorry. In this case, a lot of the losses that you have encountered, that most of you have encountered, and I would share stories of my sister lost her son at age 5. And I don't think she ever recuperated from it. And I only spoke to her like, this is like over 40 years ago, and I just spoke to her about it a year ago. I just thought I'd mention that because, to be sure, I normally say that I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what to say, but I just like to tell you I'm sorry for your loss. This is the line that I use whenever I talk to someone who is going through something. I just thought I'd mention that because I didn't hear any solution in terms of what to say. I'm very I have a lot of empathy when people are going through. And Suzanne, I have a photo of your kids. Every year you would send a photo of your kids. And I was so touched that one year it was 3 kids, and then the next year it was just 2 kids. So the one with the 2 kids I have in my Bible. And whenever I see that, I realize that in the flicker of a moment, you could be without a child. So I'm telling you that I was very touched by your story, and to listen to it afresh again today. I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you, Milton. I really appreciate it. And Milton's the husband of my college hallway mate. And Milton is one of those people that I would never have had this type of a relationship with, but it happened because we talked about it in a meaningful way over coffee one day in New York City with Arena. So these are the types of things that do occur in the aftermath of something. Those are the potential relationships that deepen because of it. So thank you, Milton. I appreciate that. And I also want to, respect everyone's time. And I just was hoping if Kelsey wanted to say a few words to wrap up, and then what I'll do is I'll put links to her book, my book, her Empathy Bootcamp information, and also there's a short video of Laura's, it's called Laura's Gift of Life. She was an organ donor. In addition, it's a whole nother part of the story, and her liver saved the life of a 40-year-old woman in upstate New York. And I write about that in the book and how meaningful that whole situation has been. And the Blood Center of Wisconsin professionally videotaped that story about 7 years ago. So I'm going to link that to that as well. But Kelsey, maybe you can say a few words to talk about, to summarize what we've been talking about today.
There's an expression that grief rearranges your address book. And I think that a lot of what this conversation today is recognizing how we can be there for each other in ways that work for us too, and how we can see others being there for us in ways that work for them. And there's a lot of compassion in both of those perspectives. And Susan, I just really appreciate how how your experience has opened a window for other people into seeing their own experience, and for you inviting me into your community. And I'm here. I'm always here. So, if anyone has any questions or anything, I really love just responding to email or something. So I'm Kelsey at empathybootcamp.com. And I don't know, I'm just very happy to have met everybody. And I love a small, intimate group like this and seeing everyone's faces. And I just want to acknowledge again what might be bringing you here today.
Kelsey, I appreciate all of your research and the effort that you put into creating your book, and for being so generous and giving of your time to do this today. I love when we can expand the network of connections related to grief. And the one thing I forgot to mention is how I truly believe, grief, we've kind of gone through, because of this pandemic, a collective grief unlike anything we've experienced in quite some time, and hopefully will not experience anything like this in the future. But grief is not just about the loss of a person. It's about the loss of a dream, or the loss of identity, or the loss of a job, or your integrity, or whatever that might be. And so we really are all have something that we're struggling with really all the time. And we need to understand that. And I guess that whole concept of kindness is your credential, and you never know what other people are dealing with at any one point. So I really loved this conversation, and just wanted to kind of give a shout out, or an update as to my next monthly call is going to be on June 16th. And I'm going to be interviewing a woman named Faith Wilcox, who just wrote a book, and we'll be talking about writing and journaling in the aftermath of grief. So hopefully I'll get that word out through social media and email. So thank you so much for coming, and feel free to reach out to any of us at any time. All right.
Okay.
It was great seeing you.
Bye. Thank you so much, Susan.
Take
Bye,
care.
everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Jen.
you.
I appreciate it.